hi, how are you? Welcome on in.
Podcast by George.
Another podcast by George.
Podcast by George. Border to border. Coast to coast. Podcast by George.
Hello, hi, how are you? Welcome on in to another podcast by George. Thanks again to Tom Murphy, Tracy Murphy for putting together that outstanding promo. I just like looking at the past guests. And in the first one mentioned, the first one you see is Matthew Ho. And there's a reason, folks. He's been one of the longest running guests on Podcast by George. I really like this guy. And he just co-authored a big full-page plea in the New York Times just a couple of days ago. We're going to be talking about that, but I want to do a proper introduction here to get his, there he is. There's his graphic for the Liveline. Matthew Ho, for folks that don't know it, and this bio all plays into this, folks. Now, he most recently was a candidate for the U.S. Senate out in North Carolina on the Green Party ticket, and to even get on the ballot out there, he had to fight a massive battle, and you got to get 14,000 signatures to appear on the ballot, and he did that and then some. So he does have the ability to persuade some hearts and minds. And that's what this plea in the New York Times is all about. We're going to talk about that. But by way of background, in 2009, Matthew resigned in protest from his post in Afghanistan with the State Department over the American escalation of the war. Now, prior to his assignment in Afghanistan, he took part in the American occupation of Iraq, first in 04-05 in Salah ad-Din province with the State Department Reconstruction and Governance Team, and then in 06-07 in Anbar province as a Marine Corps company commander. And that a good example of the people that authored this plea in the New York Times. These are people that know what they're talking about. They're the people that have the bona fides. I mean, they've got the creed. That's what this is all about. Now, when not deployed, Matthew worked on Afghanistan and Iraq war policy and operations issues at the Pentagon and State Department from 02 to 08. And then, as I mentioned, in 09, he said, screw it, I'm out of here. He wrote a brilliant resignation letter basically saying they ain't too dumb. They're in on it, folks. And that's still the case today. His writings are everywhere, including, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, Counterpunch, CNN, all the mainstream media places, and, of course, most notably with the Eisenhower Media Network. And we're going to be talking about those folks. So let's take that away. Let's poke a button here and remove that. Can we do that? Yeah, and go over here and click that. And sometimes the technology for me, I don't know why, as many times as I've done this, but there he is. Let's say good morning to our good pal, our good buddy, Matthew Ho. Hi, Matt. Oh, the microphone. Did you mute? It's still not coming in here. I'm not getting, why would that be? I don't think it's on my end. Let me double check here.
All right.
There you are.
When I went to the back room, it muted me. And then I thought I muted myself. So then I just muted my thing. And then now I'm muted and now so on and so forth. And we've only been doing this, George, for how many years now?
Well, yeah. And
right.
That sounds like just a very small example of the problem with AI. You leave the room and it mutes itself. So, right. That's just the beginning of it, folks. Okay. So we got a ton of stuff to talk about here. And I want to get going with and this is very timely because this was just in the New York Times. I'm going to start with a post from your Twitter feed here. You write that diplomacy could have averted the war in Ukraine, and diplomacy can end it. Yeah, diplomacy. Where in the hell is diplomacy, folks? And he says, please read and share Media Eisenhower's letter today in the New York Times detailing the diplomatic malpractice that led to this war and how competent diplomacy can end it. In fact, that's how it will end. We'll either all perish, because that's the ultimate end of war. It's got to stop somewhere prior to that, hopefully, and diplomacy is how it will happen. So, Matt, as you know, on the show, I like to talk about how every word means something. I've got this up on screen now. You can see it, and I've highlighted a couple of things here. This is an actual, a photo, an image of the New York Times full page. And right at the top here, and I encourage everybody, don't be headline blind when you look at this kind of stuff. This is an advertisement. I look at that and I think, well, this is an ad. A lot of people have very negative feelings about advertising. I worked in it for a number of years. But the point here is, if this point of view is going to be made in full page format in the New York Times, this is the way that it's going to happen. you got to buy it. And I suspect that's the reason why you did it and why it appears this way, Matt.
Correct. Correct. There have been individuals who have been able to get op-eds into the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post, but they've been few and far between who advocate for diplomacy. And much of the time, their arguments are tampered down or weighed down or watered down. And what we wanted to do, we wanted to make sure we would have the space to say what we wanted to say, present it in a manner that was visual as well as the timeline. And we've had a lot of feedback from a lot of people on both the use of that map and as well as the timeline. And I'm glad to see it has really helped people come to a better understanding of this conflict, because it's true, history matters. The idea that you can give a start date to certain events. Of course, we couldn't buy up the whole newspaper, so we couldn't go back hundreds of years to discuss this conflict, because you essentially could in many ways. But what we did by purchasing this ad and the placement of it, was on page A5 in the New York Times, so right at the start of the international section, right at the start of the newspaper, basically. The idea being that many places throughout Washington, D.C., New York, Los Angeles, around the world, these papers are open on tables, in the dining rooms, in the conference rooms of decision makers. And we wanted to make sure that this was seen, as well as we wanted to make sure it was reaching an audience within the New York Times that weren't hearing these views predominantly, that were predominantly hearing a different narrative, that were predominantly hearing a narrative that was dependent upon military victory, that was one-sided, that left out many key facts, but also two key ideas, such as that, this idea that, look, if the conflict is stalemated, and there's a very important article on Political today, and we can talk about it later about this, but if this truly is a stalemated conflict, then why are you shoveling more resources into it? Why are you just keeping Ukrainians being killed when you know that there's no hope of military victory here? Presenting those types of thoughts, those ideas, those positions. And we thought that the advertisement would be the best way to go about that, in terms of being able to reach the largest audience possible, say what we want to say, and say it in a manner, textually, visually, graphically, and then, of course, the timeline.
Well, and not just the largest audience possible. And I wanted to make this point right off the top here, because it's very important. It's something that you and I have talked about before. But to my mind now, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but the New York Times is the biggest war drum maybe in American history. I mean, they've supported and promoted every war. They have huge influence. They're not as big as they used to be. No newspaper is, but they still have extremely broad reach with people that read it who are the war drummers. I mean, including, Lloyd Austin right on down the line. Those people are all reading this. So that's one really important reason to do this. But the other part of it is, a lot of my militant activist friends on the left will look at this and say, hell, Matt, George, that's a waste of time. That's a waste of money. That's not going to get you anywhere. I mean, signing petitions and all that stuff, we got to get in the street. We talked about this with your candidacy in North Carolina. I mean, why do that? But you made an excellent point that these are all pieces of the puzzle, and we can't just turn over this stuff to the war drummers, because if we do, it's all lost. I mean, am I correct in this?
Right, absolutely. You cannot give up that space. You cannot give up those tools. You cannot give up those avenues. Communications, media, incredibly important. If you look at, say, the body politic, it's as a human body with organs and limbs. Communications, media is one, are one of those limbs. Just as important as getting people on the street, just as important as mutual aid, just as important as electoral work. They're all important. The idea being in this case is, how do we make sure that the people who are not seeing this message see this message, but also too, the response so far has been very positive. And one of the things noted in the weeks coming up to this letter, and that's why I think this letter was very timely, is that we've seen headlines in the Wall Street Journal, in the Washington Post, in the New York Times using the terms negotiations. These articles about how administration officials are increasingly talking about negotiations, how even article in the Wall Street Journal that says how the administration sees the Chinese as possibly being useful in negotiations. First of all, for the Wall Street, anyone who reads the Wall Street Journal, to see that they spoke kindly or positively of the Chinese is really quite something. But the fact that you see these stories coming out with these headlines, and so what you've seen the last weeks is a shifting in opinion within the administration. And this is the political piece today, talking about how there's a recognition within the administration that the Ukraine conflict, the Ukraine war, will become a frozen conflict, a la South Korea, where you don't have official boundaries, so to speak. You have a demilitarized zone, a no man's land, and each side stays on theirs. And there's a hope for negotiations in the future. Hopefully, you have a process to achieve some type of settlement. But at best, what you have is you have an end to the killing, an end to the suffering, an end to the destruction. And while that's not perfect by any means, that certainly is much, much, much more preferable to the current war. You had talked about the New York Times being a drumbeat, for war, and I agree. I think the Washington Post might have it beat out. Into, if we wanted to get into particulars,
Yeah.
right? We want to really start arguing about it.
Yeah.
However, kind of a LeBron James, Michael Jordan kind of argument, right? But I think what you see with those newspapers, and the Journal included, is you see a reflection of the establishment of particularly in foreign policy, national security, war making. You see a reflection, a mirror of the thoughts of American leadership. And often now that reflection, that mirror, is really a trumpet for them, which is incredibly unfortunate. And we could talk about all the catastrophes that have resulted from that, such as the Iraq War, the escalation of the Afghan War, the Syrian Civil War, the Libyan War, all these wars where an enthusiastic press went along with either the start of a war or the escalation of one, playing it out as if it's some kind of morality tale, and not doing their job as journalists and actually investigating and inquiring and being dissentful in a journalistic sense of the established government, of our leadership, of our foreign policy leaders. So you have that, I think, with the New York Times, is that it really can be a trumpet. But it's important, though, too, to be reading it, because it does reflect the opinions, the thoughts of leaderships, and what you've seen, I think, in the last weeks. And hopefully, I'm slightly optimistic about this. Hopefully it is the case that with these headlines about negotiations, these articles about a willingness within the administration for talks or recognition that there is no military victory in Ukraine, that something else will have to happen. And the article in Politico today talked about how different agencies within the United States government were formulating this, were looking into this. How would this look? What can we do about it? That shows that whereas a couple of months ago, to say the word negotiations in Washington, D.C. was like a thought crime. It was incredibly treasonous, incredibly unpatriotic. How dare you not believe in, what we're doing in Ukraine? And you have that in all wars. This jingoism that gets attached to the war effort, that any type of criticism is, blanketed as not just dishonest, but immoral, cowardly, deceitful. Oftentimes you're criticized and you're told that you're, particularly now, you're the tool of a foreign operative, that you're really on the side of, in this case, the Russians, or you were Saddam Hussein sympathizer, or you want to see the Taliban execute women. Those are all the things that are thrown at you when you dissent from a policy that will not work. And I think, getting back to the letter, that's the crux of the letter, is that, one, there is diplomatic malpractice, that for decades the United States willfully chose policies that it knew would lead to further conflict.
I want to get
That
back
doesn't
to
absolve Russia of what it did, but it does set the
right.
stage. And then the other thing is that if you know that it is impossible to win, if victory is not possible, if you cannot win in this battle, in this war, then why are you fighting it? Why did you choose to fight it?
Yeah.
If the United States knew it could not supply enough 155 millimeter artillery rounds to Ukraine to fight the Russians, why did it allow Ukraine to get to this point? Why did it not do more to avert this war with Russia? And certainly for those who say, oh, you could, now there's plenty that could have been done to avert this war. So those who say the Russians don't negotiate, they just extended the Black Sea wheat and grain deal again. They've had more than 50 prisoner of war exchanges. They work with the Atomic Energy Association on the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. The Russians are people that you can work with. Don't listen to this characterization, these Cold War tropes about how they are, just two-dimensional evil characters, as if they're some kind of troll out of the Lord of the Rings franchise, right? So those are the things we're trying to get across in this letter.
I will get to some of the particulars of it here very shortly, but a couple of things. Just hearing you talk, it strikes me again. I get in the Wayback Machine all the time. Go back to my childhood, the Vietnam War. I mean, again, we came to the realization that sans a nuclear option, we weren't going to win. I mean, we were just going to take losses. It wasn't happening, folks. So what'd we do? We got out after all of those losses in a hideous war. Well, Ukraine strikes me as very similar. I mean, it can't be won. This can't be reconciled militarily. And it ain't happening unless you use the nukes, for God's sake. And nobody wants to do that. So settle it, negotiate it, get some diplomacy going. Now, here's another big reason, another great thing. And it's a perfect example of why this advertisement, this letter, this plea was so valuable in the New York Times. And it's Medea Benjamin, who's been getting a lot of FaceTime on my show recently. But I want people to look at this. This is a perfect example of the value of this. Take it away, Medea.
Hi, my name is Medea Benjamin, and I'm about to go into Congress to hand out copies of this full-page advertisement that came out in the New York Times today, thanks to the Eisenhower Media Network, and signed by foreign policy experts around the United States who say that we have to, oh my goodness, look at the issue in Ukraine through Russia's eyes, something that we are never told to do in the New York Times. Well, while this group of experts condemns the Russian invasion, it says we have to look at the series of provocations from the United States that led up to the invasion, and we have to reverse course right now. Instead of continuing to fuel this war, we must become a force for peace in the world by pushing for negotiations. Let's see how it goes over when I hand it to members of the Senate this morning at the hearing on the future of U.S.-Russia relations.
And she gave one to Secretary Blinken. That
great.
Yeah.
And she walks it like she talks it, folks.
Oh,
she does. And she's going to do something. She does it. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And she had just actually disrupted Secretary Blinken a week or two ago on Press Freedom Day. He was doing his big event with the Washington Post, and David Ignatius
went right on stage
interviewing him, and her and Teague Barry went up there and asked about Julian Assange and Shireen Abu Akleh.
Yes.
And of course they were, but that event, what she did was so important for those who watch the Washington Post live stream, who read the Washington Post, because they don't hear those things, right? So they could have gone through this whole 2-hour spectacle the Washington Post was running with the Secretary of State about World Press Freedom Day, and it just may not have occurred to them. Well, what about Julian Assange?
Yes.
Oh my gosh, a year ago, the Israelis murdered an American journalist in Palestine. And the Americans have done nothing but say, oh, it's okay. Well, it was an accident. I mean, murder in cold blood. Yeah. And they're not talking about that on World Press Freedom Day. So like doing that type of work. And I think that's one of the things with the letter too, what we're trying to achieve is that it opens up space for others. It shows others that there are people who think like that. There are organizations that think like this. There are people who can put their words into action and get things done that think like this. I first experienced this in 2010 when I ran the Afghan study group, and we brought together 50 people from across DC in the US, foreign policy experts, retired generals, academics, former diplomats, etc., who we wrote a letter saying the United States needs to get out of Afghanistan. This is how it should be. We should do it like this, but we need to get out. And what that letter did was that it allowed other organizations to then follow us, because there's a real fear to go first. There really is. You would like to think that's not the case, but there really is a need for a trailblazer, if you will. And I don't want to make this sound too grandiose or hyperbolic, right? But this idea that somebody has to go first, somebody has to open space. And like I said, there have been plenty of individuals, plenty of organizations, plenty of coalitions that have been saying what we've been saying. And for us to have the resources do what we did, opens the space more for others to join, right? They see that there are these people, these former national security officials, military veterans, who are saying this so publicly, so demonstrably. Okay, well, what should we be doing about it? Or since Eisenhower Media already did this, since Code Pink already did that, since all these other groups have done this, since Quincy Institute has said this, maybe we should say this, right? The space, I don't like this phrase. I'm sure you probably don't either, but like the Overton window expands, where what's allowable to be discussed. And our timing, I think, is very good, because again, you're seeing this willingness for the administration to even admit to the need for negotiations now, whereas a couple of months ago, again, that term negotiations was a bad word that shouldn't be uttered. Almost it reminds me very much of how during the Bush administration we weren't allowed to say that the war in Iraq was an occupation, because somehow uttering that emitted a degree of guilt, emitted a truth that they didn't want uttered.
Yeah, and the other thing about it is, you take out a full-page ad like this, if you'd have done, and I know you draft news releases all the time, send a news release to the New York Times editorial department on these very same topics, won't even get read, won't even get looked at. The war drummers will never see it. And you think, well, okay, this is an advertisement, and, editors don't pay any attention to that. Oh, yeah, guarantee you. Every single one of those guys and gals that would not look at that news release or give it an inch of space, they all saw that. So there's immense value in it. I wanted to bring this up before I left the issue of Medea Benjamin, because Code Pink went in there. I mean, and they're in there all the time. God, what a thorn in the side that they are. And Medea writes that this photo is iconic. It's from yesterday's Senate hearing on China. Seeing Olivia DeNucci with this sign behind Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin warms my heart. Too bad she was arrested for it. She was arrested for holding up a sign. Mm-hmm. Yeah, let me play this. This is something else. Again, here comes a video. Watch this, folks.
I was just arrested for holding a sign saying money for the poor, not war. The Pentagon budget this year is nearing $1 trillion. We are building more bases surrounding China to prop up more war, yet we don't have money for climate justice, for housing, for healthcare, for livable wages. We're not addressing the common enemy of the entire planet, which is the climate crisis. The Pentagon's the biggest polluter in the world. Anthony Blinken, the Secretary of State, and Lloyd Austin, the head of the Department of, in quotes, Defense, are in there testifying, asking for more and more money to increase never-ending wars. And I was arrested for holding up a sign, and it's what's supposed to be the people's house.
They were distinguishing China with the dictatorship and we're the democracy, and yet you get arrested for holding up a sign.
We need to be able to stand up and say what we want, utilize our First Amendment rights, and demand that this government in our country protects us and provides support for the people.
And the doors close, and there you go. And it also reminds me, I wanted to say this also about that prior action with Medea when they stepped on stage with the Washington Post. They'd sat there for 2 hours politely listening to that, backslapping and glad handing. And really what they were talking about at the time, particularly, was that Wall Street Journal reporter that's being held in Russia on espionage charges. And my God, here we are making sure that Julian Assange stays in that prison in Belmarsh. Actually, we're trying to get him back over here to try him for espionage, for a capital offense, for God's sake. The United States is doing that. The media is not supporting itself, and including the Reuters journalists that were killed that has something to do with Assange being in Belmarsh. And so they leapt to their feet and said, my God, what about Assange? What about Shireen Abu Akleh? As Matt said, I mean, let's talk real journalism. Let's talk life and death here. And let's point the finger where it deserves to be pointed. And that, again, has a lot to do with this article in the New York Times. Now, I'm not going to be able to read this because it's going to strain my eyes, but I think I can read this first paragraph, Matt, and get your comments. The Russian-Ukraine war has been an unmitigated disaster. Hundreds of thousands have been killed. Let me say that again. Hundreds of thousands have been killed. Good Lord, on both sides, folks, Ukraine and Russia, killed or wounded. Millions have been displaced. Environmental and economic devastation have been incalculable. That's not an easy word for me to say. Future devastation could be exponentially greater as nuclear powers creep ever closer toward open war. And one of the reasons I highlighted it, and it's a perfect, and that's the reason it's the opening paragraph, but people don't realize this. It's bad, but this could get a hell of a lot worse, Matt.
Right, right. And the devastation that has occurred, I think, is not readily understood at this point. There was a rush of media into the country last year, and then at some point over the last year, that media reporting has died out a bit. And so I don't think the full understanding of the violence that is occurring there is understood. The Russians reportedly are using 20,000 artillery shells a day. I mean, that's a massive amount of artillery. Nothing like that has been seen since the Second World War, I believe. Maybe there's a conflict I'm forgetting, but in terms of that sustained volume, tempo of artillery fire, I don't think there's been anything like that in 80 years. I guess the Korean War, possibly. The devastation and the death and the destruction. The cost of war program at Brown University just put out a report this past week that the wars in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Yemen, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Somalia have killed between 4 and 4.5 million people. Most of those come from indirect deaths. Deaths attributable to whether it's ongoing militia violence that occurs, civil war, whether it's disease, hunger, starvation, lack of medical access, things like people dying because of poisoning, because of burn pits or depleted uranium. That's the total for the American wars in the Muslim world for the last 20 years is 4 to 4.5 million people. And those numbers continue to grow, because the deaths and the suffering don't stop just because the bullets stop flying. You could take in Iraq, such a horrible example with the Iraqis, where in parts of Iraq, you have cancer rates that are 12 times higher among children than what they should be. During years in Iraq, in Fallujah, half of the mothers who were pregnant lost their children, either miscarriage or stillborn. So the consequences keep going, and that poisoning is there and doesn't leave and will last for generations, just as it has done in Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia. So what we're seeing right now, what we know about the violence, the death, the destruction in Ukraine, is only the tip of the proverbial iceberg. So we know that if we believe what we learned from Discord leaks from the Soviet security agency, the FSB. That the Russians have had 100,000 casualties, so that's killed and wounded together. The Ukrainians most likely have had a similar number. I'm not going to get into an argument over who has had more. I don't think anyone knows right now. Both sides lie about it. Both sides obscure it. One of the funny things that about the Discord leaks, which were the classified documents released by that Air Guardsman up in Massachusetts, that young man who wanted to impress his friends or whatever, and put out all these top secret documents. In that you see caveats, footnotes, bullets explaining that the Americans can't trust what the Ukrainians are saying. So there's a deliberate obscuring of what's occurring there in terms of who's being killed, how many are killed. But the understanding what we have in the United Nations says there's more than 20,000 civilian casualties, about 8,000 of them killed, 9,000 killed. But again, that's probably an undercount. We don't know. We won't know for many years. And as we're saying, with the indirect deaths, how many Ukrainians? And there's also some really interesting work out there. The guy named Carl Canetta with the Project for Defense Alternatives put a great piece together, examining the costs of this Ukraine war throughout the world. And just even in Europe alone, the amount of excess deaths this past winter. Remember, Europe had a mild winter, and the Europeans spent $1 trillion subsidizing their energy costs this year. The European governments did. Even with all that, the estimate is that there were thousands of Europeans, particularly in Germany, who died because of higher energy costs. And that's something we're aware of, right? Energy costs go up. People can't afford to heat their homes, especially older people, and they end up suffering and dying. Same thing with food costs. We saw a rise in food costs. Fortunately, that didn't last as long as people were afraid it would. It was essentially stabilized by end of summertime. But still, there was a catastrophe that resulted from it, where people who were already hungry, who were already food insecure, were now facing this tragedy of not being able to get enough food. And so the estimates of excess deaths outside of the war zone because of rising energy costs and rising food costs number in the tens of thousands, possibly hundreds of thousands.
Yeah.
And this is not, some hippie peacenik who puts ads in the New York Times saying this. This is, the governments of Europe saying this. This is the United Nations saying this. This is magazines like The Economist. No friend to hippie peaceniks like George or Matt. So this is not stuff that we're just bantering around here on the sidelines. This is what, academics, researchers, scientists, NGOs are saying. So if you can understand that, the catastrophe of this war, one that you can imagine that there will be many, many, many more times dead in Ukraine than we understand now, even if the guns were to fall silent right now. There's still going to be people who die. Look, there's 14 million refugees, both internally and externally, from Ukraine. I mean, just the devastation, the suffering that's occurred here, the trauma that is ongoing. And then, of course, this war, in a way that the wars in Iraq and Syria and Libya and Afghanistan certainly had their effects, certainly had particularly their regional effects, or say the amount of refugees that went to Europe because of the wars in Syria, because of the Iraq war, the Afghan war, because of the war in Libya, and tens of thousands of people died trying to get to Europe. I mean, the Mediterranean is just littered with families who died trying to save themselves, getting to some safe territory in Europe. Those numbers continue to grow. And what we've seen with the Ukraine war is that its ability to affect people around the world is something that I think most people are not aware of.
Well, let me bring this up on screen too, because we've got the Rose in the house, and Rose makes an excellent point here. And this isn't reported enough or understood well enough. These sanctions, they just get announced, and then we kind of forget about it with our collective amnesia in America. We've got these killer sanctions still in Syria, these Caesar sanctions, I think they're called. And of course, we're sanctioning because of the situation in Ukraine, sanctioning Russia. But the point of it is, and Russia's a good example. You got Putin up there. I mean, he's a murderous killer. I'm no fan of Putin's. He's former KGB. He's a kook and a spook up there. He's already sent 100,000, at least, maybe more, young Russian men to their death in the situation in Ukraine. He doesn't give a damn about sanctions, and the war has killed the young men. Who do the sanctions harm? Do they harm Putin and the oligarchs in Russia? No, they harm the children and the women that are left behind. The sanctions harm the civilians. And then nuts will say, well, yeah, but if you harm them enough, maybe they'll rise up and overthrow Putin. Oh my God, that ain't happening. It ain't happening with Assad. It didn't happen in Iraq with Hussein. These sanctions are just, they're not understood well enough, Matt.
They are. They're a war crime in many ways, but they're also against international law. They are an act of war. Sanctions are no different than, in the old time days when you'd sail your ship up to somebody's harbor and put a giant iron chain across it to prevent anyone from getting in or out. I mean, it's the same type of aspect. It's an economic blockade, essentially, and that's against international law. That's an illegal coercive measure. And this is one of the reasons why the United States does not cite international law. It cites rules-based order. You hear this all the time from Joe Biden, Secretary Blinken, from whether they be Republican or Democrats. This idea that we have a rules-based order. And of course, the idea is that we set the rules and everyone has to follow that. If we follow the international law, the United States, of course, itself would be just as liable for war crimes as Russia is, in the sense of our invasion of Iraq, our roles in Libya and in Syria, our facilitation of the war in Yemen, but also too through our torture campaign, our extrajudicial assassination campaign, whether it be by drone or by commandos, our rendition campaigns where we kidnap people across the world, our indefinite detention, where we still have men in Guantanamo Bay who have never been charged with anything, who have been there for 2 decades now, let alone the hundreds before them that were released who were never charged with anything, who are innocent. I mean, so this idea that the United States is following a rules-based order, that is purposely said by the United States government because it knows it's in clear violation of international law. The sanctions are not having the effect on Russia that was intended. There's an article today in the New York Times trying to make a case that sanctions are working. We'll see. You know, one of the things I find that's real instructive at this point too, particularly say this last year, if there's ever been a case where, you know, don't get lost, don't lose sight of the forest for the trees, it's the case of the Ukraine war, because there's so much put out every day. The Post, the Times, they're running 6-7 stories a day sometimes. There's so much you can see on Twitter, on Telegram, I mean, all over the place. And, you know, if you follow that, you just get lost in the numbers, the daily, you know, and what people are saying each day, and they're not seeing the trends. I mean, so if you follow that, you would have believed that Russia was going to run out of ammunition last March. You know, but if you look at the trends, you see that they've been able to sustain a volume of attacks on the Ukrainians that, you know, show that they don't have logistical problems. They don't have supply problems. Are there stories that can be said about how something went well or something went wrong or how this was big or that was small? Absolutely, of course. But the trend, and this was the case, say, in Afghanistan or Iraq, you know, whenever the United States government said it was doing so great and would cite an example and show something. Well, you know, the idea is that, okay, but still, look, the Taliban keep putting more roadside bombs into the ground every month. Yeah, I know you just said you just captured these guys and killed those guys and did this thing. But the thing is, last month they put 150 roadside bombs on the ground. This month they put in 175. Next month they put in 200. The trend line is going the wrong way. And that's what you see here. You see this, as much as you can cite things such as the Russian budget deficit this first few months of the year is greater than what they expected, a few $100 billion more, you know, excuse me, or 300 billion rubles more. Well, okay. I mean, but look at the trend, look at how it's going, and look at their ability to produce, as well as what partners have they brought into this war. Okay, they've lost certain markets, but their trade has actually gone up since last year because of China, because of India, two most populous countries of the world. And, you know, by however you want to measure it, the first and third largest economies in the world. You know, that they're, you know, you look at it that way, George, if you say, well, because the title in the Times story today was about oil revenue. And if you look at it, you can say, well, now, you know, a year and a half ago, China, India were not the biggest importers of Russian fuel. And now you say, well, now China and India, again, the first and third largest economies in the world, are the biggest importers of fuel from Russia. Well, okay, that's a big story. That makes me doubt all these other things and makes me think that, okay, it may not be perfect. It may not be glowing for Russia. They definitely have to struggle and get through it, but they're going to get through it.
Sure.
You know, and so it's like that type of perspective I think we have to have. And we have to be careful, of course, with what we're reading. This is the most heavily propagandized war on all sides. But getting back to the sanctions, the Russians knew the sanctions were coming. They had been sanctioned since at least 2014, if not earlier.
Well, we sanctioned them before the war, some, didn't we? There were
right.
sanctions.
President Obama started sanctions. I can't remember if there was even sanctions in 2013 against Russia, but there was a decline of starting in the beginning of the second Obama administration, which I also tie to the first issuing of permits for the construction of liquid natural gas export facilities to get into the European market for Russian for American fracked natural gas, because it had to go someplace, right?
Yeah.
So if you go back and you look at this and you say, how did we go from 11 years ago when Barack Obama's debating Mitt Romney on the presidential debate, and Obama mocks Romney for saying that Russia is our greatest adversary. He mocks him. He says, you're living in the Cold War. It's 2012. We could get with it. how do we go from there to here? A lot of it to me has to do with the liquid natural gas
Sure.
exports. It had to go someplace, and Europe was a great market. And you've seen that the United States over the last decade, because of fracking, has become the biggest liquid natural gas exporter in the world. We are the biggest gas exporter to Europe. Europe, of course, is playing a huge cause for that. You've had the issue, another war crime with the destruction of the Nord Stream gas
Interesting.
pipelines, which doesn't get talked about at all, just gets ignored.
Yes.
Not just an international crime in the sense of destruction of not just Russian property, but our allies' property, the property of Germany, right? I mean, so, and I think France also had a huge stake in that. So, but you also had environmental crime because that caused massive environmental damage. Another aspect of the Ukrainian war not really discussed, and that was
Yes.
the environmental damage.
Forever. Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, all this, but Russia was able to prepare for the sanctions. They had been under sanctions for a number of years. They had seen how the United States had used sanctions against many other countries, against Venezuela, against Iran, et cetera. So they knew what to prepare for. And I
Yeah.
think over the last decade, since 2014, the Russians, I think, were trying to negotiate. I do believe there's sincerity in that. At the same time, too, they were preparing for war. And I think they were building out their factories, they were building out their industrial base. They were preparing to be self-sustaining because they knew the sanctions were coming. They knew this is how the Americans were going to react. And so they prepared themselves for it. And I think that's what you saw this past year, where the shock and awe that was supposed to have come from American economic sanctions just didn't appear.
Happen. Well,
And the Russian economy. I have a friend just got back from Russia visiting family, and she says, prices are up a bit. Some things aren't on the shelves, but no different than here in the U.S.
and if you can believe the polls, and you got to believe them a little bit, Putin is still popular. I mean, he's still the man when it comes to Russia. And I've told people on my show lots of times, I'm not a great historian. I don't go back into the, way back machine like Matt does to research this stuff. But I know recent precedent. I know current events, for God's sake. And as we discussed, some sanctions were in place against Russia before the war. How did that work? Did that prevent them 1 minute from invading Ukraine? Did that make them get their mind right and pay attention and do what we wanted them to do? Not at all. And the other example is, my God, you can't forget this, Cuba. How's that working? We've been sanctioning Cuba for decades, for God's sake, trying to get them to see things our way. They never have. And if the sanctions stay in place, they never will. I wanted to bring this up on screen because of Rose here. Again, this is people should not forget this. She says, Madeleine Albright called hundreds of thousands of Iraqi children dead from U.S. sanctions worth it. Yeah, go on YouTube. You can find that interview. Straight face, that old alligator wrestler said hundreds of thousands of children, maybe 500,000 dead to advance the nation's unique form of democracy. And when she died, God, Democrats prostrated themselves because she'd been employed by some Democratic administrations or something. God, if you look up war criminal in the dictionary, you're going to see her picture, in my mind. I mean, that's what we're talking about here. And this just gets to be, common groupthink in America, Matt.
Right. And, Madeleine Albright, to her dying days, said she regretted saying that. And she didn't say it because she made a mistake or she didn't hear the question right or it was inaccurate or she disagreed with it. She made a mistake because it made her look bad.
Yeah.
She regretted saying it because it showed a truth that they didn't want shown, didn't want known. And those sanctions killed maybe as many as 1 million Iraqis. When I was in Iraq, the Iraqis talked about the sanctions all the time. So when I was there in 04, 05, they would talk about it in a way that it was just apparent how staggering those sanctions were, how awful they were, how people's children died because of them. And this was a modern society that then went through the sanctions. So the medicine they once had, they could no longer get.
Kids died. They don't forget that. I mean, that's the other part of it. This
Exactly.
long-term generational. My God, what the footprint that we're leaving around the world. I mean, it's going to bury us all, folks.
Well, and it's a 1-2 punch with the sanctions. So what you have is of course, the Iran-Iraq war, which was a proxy war for the United States, and Iraq, particularly southern and eastern parts of the nation, took a lot of damage, a lot of destructions. Entire cities were really destroyed. But then you had after that, you had the first Iraq War, the Persian Gulf War, where the United States Air Force and Navy just destroyed, absolutely just flattened critical infrastructure throughout the country, bridges, water treatment facilities. I mean, throughout the country, electrical stations throughout the country. And then the sanctions came on. So the Iraqis couldn't even get the materials to replace what had been before. So they went for decades without water treatment facilities. And they had engineers who could have fixed them if they could have just gotten the parts, but they couldn't. And this is why sanctions are a form of terrorism. This is why they are war crimes. I'm glad Rose brought this up. And this is the idea, is to starve people out. What you usually get, though, is because this is the grand strategy behind sanctions, is that you're going to make people so uncomfortable, make them hurt so bad, we're going to kill their children, and then they're going to blame their government, overthrow them, and it never works.
Never works.
It never works. I mean, there's been I've read through stuff on this, and there's like a case with India where sanctions worked in the 60s. And that's what they cite, you know? I mean, like, that's it. You know, let alone the most glaring example, Cuba, of course. But you see it where sanctions kill people, and they kill them in the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions. And so what you've had in Russia is, one, you have a president who is popular. And I mean, the numbers say 70%. And I've not seen anything to disagree with that number, unfortunately. I think that's his popularity. The awful thing about it is, if, say, this grand American plan worked and this war caused a collapse in Russia, and Putin becomes a victim to that, and he has to leave office or whatever, gets overthrown, the people most likely replace him are further to the right of him, are much more hardliners than him. Putin has a whole cast of characters there that he's fending off. This is people should understand this. Putin is under constant attack that he's not tough enough on Ukraine. He has people in his government who think that the Russians should use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. This is what we're up against, in the sense of like this idiocy, this idea that if we just do it hard enough to the Russians, get enough Ukrainians die against them, right, that it will bring Putin down, and some type of liberal reformer is going to sweep into office. This fantasy land that people in Washington, D.C. live in. And so, you know, I mean, what could come from the success of that is horrifying, because nothing good will come from it. But what you really get, though, what we're getting right now, and this is what I've heard from, is the popularity of the war. And I shouldn't say popularity, the support for the war in Russia is quite high. One, the Russians have a controlled media, of course, and they're able to quash dissent. And, you know, if you protest the war, Medea Benjamin would have been in prison. First of all, she would have been in prison well before this, but Medea Benjamin would have been in prison, right away.
Disappeared.
Right. You know, I mean, but the controlled media they have are able to shape it. But even still, they have ways of hearing through Telegram and other apps what's happening there, and certainly hear back from the soldiers or from the head of the Wagner mercenary forces, who runs his mouth and criticizes the generals and everything. But still, the support for the war among the Russian people is relatively high, and primarily because they understand it as a war of self-defense. And I know for a lot of people here, that's really hard to understand. But I think if you put the sanctions in perspective, right? If you put the expansion of NATO up to their borders, you add in all the history, if you add in Charles XII and, Lord Palmerston and the Kaiser and Hitler and Napoleon, and the fact that, it didn't make it in this draft. We talked a bit about how most Americans don't know the United States had troops in Russia after the First World War. We had soldiers on both the east and western sides of Russia trying to make sure the old Tsarist monarchy was going to stay in power and defeat the Bolshevik Revolution. People forget this, that 100 years ago, there were American troops in Russia killing Russians. Russians don't forget that.
Yeah, just 100 years ago.
All that, you got to put all that in perspective, and you start to understand, okay, this is why the Russian people, not Vladimir Putin, his cadre, the Russian people, many of them view this as a war of self-defense.
I want to bring this show this book because this is Medea's book with Nicholas J.S. Davies, The War in Ukraine. I encourage everybody to get this. It's not huge. It's not thick. I mean, you'll be a real smarty pants about Ukraine if you read this thing. Or if you just want the cliff notes, and again, it speaks to the value of this article. That's kind of what this is. This full page in the New York Times. I think one of the most valuable parts of it, Matt, and you mentioned this earlier, and maybe this is how we'll wrap up here because we're coming close to our hour timeline, is the timeline here. I mean, it lays out very definitively, beginning with 1990. Now, you can go back to, Alexander the Great if you want to, but just beginning in 1990, step by step, it lays out exactly what's happened here, not telling you who's at fault. It's Russia that's at fault, but it is laying out a little bit of the provocation for this thing also, man.
Right. It does. And, one of the things too about going through the Times is we knew we'd be fact checked. So we actually did, they did ask us to remove one thing because it was a question of opinion and a question of reading and context. And we didn't have a problem with that. That's okay. But that was the only, but they did fact check everything. And if you look at the draft that we sent them, I mean, a third of the document is like underlined blue links to hyperlinks. Most of the time we try to link back to New York Times stories itself, right? To demonstrate where we were getting our information from. Where was this the case? Was this said? When did this happen? Oh, they really said, so I think that was one of the strengths in doing it this way, was that it was verified by the Times. Nothing we're saying in there is made up. You can criticize us for leaving things out maybe, or if we're out of context or whatever. But, again, we could be here all day debating that stuff. The idea being is, where are we now? Understanding that what brought us here was diplomatic malpractice, this willingness to pursue conflict rather than resolution, this willingness to confront and provoke as opposed to listen and understand, motivated by a host of things. Whether it be the arms industry, whether it be the fossil fuel industry. We've talked about this before, right? Two biggest exports of America last year, fossil fuels and weapons. Yeah. Agriculture is third. This is who we are as a nation. And so our policies reflect that. So how we got to this point, but then where do we go? Understanding what got us here, understanding how not listening, how provoking, how ignoring red lines. And it was clear, the Russians made it very clear that they had red lines. And why did not the Americans and our NATO allies understand those red lines? The Russians said in Georgia, there's this red line. And when that was violated, they waged a week-long war against the Georgians. In Syria, they said for years, knock it off with Assad. This is a red line for us. If you don't stop, we are going to intervene and we will make sure Assad wins. And that's what they did, right? In Ukraine, they said, this is the red line for us. And in 2014, there was a coup. And what did the Russians do? They put troops into Donbass, helped out a civil war there, and then took Crimea. I mean, why did we think they were bluffing? So you could not have thought they were bluffing. If you thought they were bluffing, you are going back to what your favorite phrase, right, George? Yeah. You're too dumb or you're in on it. Yeah. And so I think having that perspective helps inform you, where do we go from here? And if you understand this war as impossible to achieve military victory, just to the fact that the Ukrainian army is not and cannot be big enough to expel the Russian army from Ukraine. They're just not big enough. Just as the Russian army is not big enough, has never been, and will never be big enough to conquer all of Ukraine. It can't. And, if you don't have the artillery, then you don't have the missiles, you don't have the factories in Europe and United States, even though we spend trillions of dollars every year on our military industrial complex, but when it comes time for a war, they can't seem to make bullets and missiles and artillery shells. Shows you what a racket that is, right? Yeah. But the idea that if this is the case where the war is unwinnable, yes, why are you pursuing it then? Right. What are your purposes? And all you're doing is you're asking Ukrainians to die for your fantasy of some type of moral victory over the Russians.
Well, and that's from the movie Casino, that line. That's why I wanted to show it here. But the other part of it here, and I'll bring this up. This is from the great Courtney Conover. Now, she watches my show. She's a fan, I think. She says, let's keep asking these psychopaths nicely to please stop. Now, a couple of things I'd say about that. Why do they keep doing that? I think, Matt, and you and I have talked about this. I think we've got nuts on the loose in a higher percentage of them than we think. Just in the general population, there's a percentage of people that are going to have psychopathic issues. I think a lot of them reside in our government, in Congress. I mean, I'm not being silly or facetious here. I really think that is the case. That's why would they do this? Why do they do that type of thing? And then the other part of it, I would say, to the point that we made earlier, this advertisement, this full page, is just part of the puzzle here. It's just one of the pieces. It does entail doing other things, and Matt's done so much of this. I mean, my God, he's run for office. He's been in the street. He went to Iraq and Afghanistan, folks. I mean, but this again is just one part of it. It is a piece of the puzzle, and I think given who it reaches, who gets to read it and maybe causes them to think a little bit, it's a very important piece. Well, we've got just a couple of minutes here, Matt. Is there anything that you want to say in closing here? You want to give us a wrap up on this particular?
Right.
I wanted to bring this up. Let me very quickly, because this is a friend of yours.
I slid away to grab my copy of Norman Cousins' The Pathology of Power, which speaks exactly to that, how many people in office are sociopaths.
They're nuts.
Particularly at the senior level, particularly at the federal level.
Yeah. Let me bring this up from the great Bill Astori. I've had him on the show a lot. I really like this. And again, he's with the Eisenhower Media Network. He says, Winston Churchill said, meeting jaw to jaw is better than war. It's high time the U.S. facilitated jaw to jaw diplomacy rather than feeding more war and death in Ukraine. And you think, God, it's not as simple as that, George. Yeah, it kind of is. I mean, that's kind of what we need to do. We need to start the process. And again, that was the genesis for this great full page in the New York Times. And I just kind of want to leave it there, Matt. But I want to give you last word here because you're very good at it. Give us a close.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought Bill up. Bill played a huge role in this letter. I wrote the first draft, and then Bill turned it into something that was readable and understandable. And,
he's a great writer,
right. I mean, just absolutely fantastic. And then a bunch of other people contributed as well, and really great team effort to put this together. And but yeah, this idea that diplomacy is better than war, I think that's one of the purposes of our organization, the Eisenhower Media Network is exactly that. People who've done this, people who've seen it, people who can tell you from our own mistakes, our own transgressions, the sins we committed, that this is the diplomacy is much better than war, that nothing comes out of warfare that has any benevolence, any benefit. Noam Chomsky did a study one time, and I think he found that the only war of aggression where one nation actually did something that you could vaguely resemble humanitarian reasons was when Vietnam invaded Cambodia to stop the Khmer Rouge in the late 70s. Other than that, all these wars we have, more than 250 times since the end of the Cold War. So just in the last 30 some odd years, the United States military has invaded, occupied, intervened. We've staged coups. We've run proxy wars, had military operations, sent in commandos, launched drone strikes more than 250 times on a sustained level throughout the world in the last 32 years. I mean, that tells you who we are as a society. Remember again, right? Our two main exports are fossil fuel and weapons. And, the Courtney's point about, we have to do it all. You have to do the communication piece. You have to influence people. You have to inform people, educate people, but you have to do so much more. Code Pink was just, Code Pink, I think, is a great example of how much they do, what they do across the board. They're putting out a letter next week in the Hill, very similar, an advertisement in the Hill, trying to persuade people, trying to inform people, trying to get decision makers who read the Hill to think differently, put that little spark in their head. But also, too, Code Pink just the other day, you had Olivia getting arrested. We talked about Medea and Teague.
They're heroes. Yeah.
And then just yesterday, they disrupted the Northrop Grumman shareholders meeting, right? I think it was Olivia again. Went and just, but then also too, they do a ton of stuff online. They organize locally. There's an organization called the Peace in Ukraine Coalition that does a ton of work, in terms of making sure people locally are involved. And so there's not a question of where one thing is going to be the silver bullet. That there's one way to do this correctly. Anyone who thinks that way, I just don't think has the experience in this, or has the I shouldn't say that like that, but understands the totality of it, how you have to do it all. There's no ceding any part of this. You have to be in the streets. You have to be politically involved. You have to be involved in the media. You have to be involved educationally. You have to be involved locally. You have to be involved on the state level. One of my favorite efforts, one of the best anti-war efforts out there, probably the best anti-war effort out there, is by an organization called Bring Our Troops Home. Defend the Guard Act. It's been introduced in over 30 state legislatures. The idea being that the National Guard cannot be deployed overseas to a foreign war without a declaration of war by Congress.
I've never understood that. Yeah.
Right. And so it's this idea that if people understand what that means, if that was to take place, 40% of the troops that took part in the Afghan and Iraq wars came from the National Guard and the reserves. So the American war machine depends upon the National Guard to do its work. It can't operate without it. Even right now in Syria, and it has been this way for the last few years, the troops guarding those oil fields that we are owning in Syria, we have about 1,000 troops in Syria, about 3,000 troops in Iraq. People don't know this. The mission there, we control about a third of Syria. We're illegally occupying Syria. So all our complaints about Russia are kind of thrown away by the fact that we're doing the same thing in Syria.
Trump bragged about it.
And blatantly to control their oil fields. At one point, the Trump administration was selling that oil to a private company. We have no idea where the oil is going now, by the way, just so people know. So I'm not sure what's worse, the overt selling of oil to a private company that we took illegally from a sovereign nation, or the obscure destination of that oil today. But the troops that are there guarding those oil fields that are now suffering drone attacks, there was a contractor killed a month or two ago. Those are National Guard's troops. So these men and women are getting called up and they're being sent overseas, and the Congress has not weighed in on the validity of these things. They keep citing the 2001 authorization for use of military force, the original authorization for military force after the September 11 attacks, still in effect. And that's what our leaders in Congress point to and say, well, this justifies our young men and women being called up, being sent overseas, dying and killing other people. It's all based upon a decision made in this Congress 22 years ago in the days after the 9/11 attacks. So the Defend the Guard Act, I think, is probably the best thing out there right now that would have a real remarkable change. And it has a lot of support. It's getting through committees. It's getting floor votes. And it's one of those efforts where it takes time. Anyone who thinks legislation is just, in the first time it's introduced, it gets through, particularly on a national level.
No, you got to start. Yeah.
We finally got the ERA passed a couple of years ago. Right.
Well,
I mean, how long did that take?
The suffragette movement. I mean, women's vote. I mean, they had introduced that a number of times. And that was kind of the thing about Medicare for all. I mean, everybody, oh, what the hell? It's going to get on the floor. What are you pushing for that for? It's going to get defeated. No, you got to start. It's a process. It takes a long time. It can happen, but it's not easy. Well, that thing about the Guard's a great point to end with there, Matt. My ending point would be, everybody out there, quit saying that the Ukraine war is justified and that you support the Ukraine war because Russia invaded a sovereign nation. My God, can you say Iraq? Can you say Syria? Can you say what the hell? I mean, come on, people. It just begs credulity. It's an insult to an injury when people carry on like that. Matt, we got to leave it there, pal. We're at the top of the hour. I mean, I really appreciate you coming on. That thing in the New York Times, that was big news. Good to the Eisenhower Media Network. Stay on them. Keep doing it. We'll circle back here just as soon as we possibly can.
All right. Thanks, George. I appreciate it.
Yeah, man, that was great. I'm telling you, I just love Matthew Ho. That's great, folks. And if you love seeing him on the show, if you like hearing his perspective and seeing that article in the New York Times as an example, because a lot of people, myself included, don't subscribe to it because I can't afford it. Watch Podcast by George, and we'll get it on there for you. And you can subscribe to my show now by going to Facebook or YouTube. You can sign up there, or you can go to podcastbygeorge.com where you can subscribe to all of the platforms that you like. You can easily do Facebook and YouTube by clicking on their icons. You can also pick the audio platforms that you like. If you just want to hear the audio of the show on iTunes or Spotify, the iHeartRadio app, Deezer, Stitcher, all of those places, you can do that at podcastbygeorge.com. Folks, that's going to do it. That's going to wrap it up. That's all there is. And there ain't no more. That's another podcast by George.